It's late evening in Yaoundé. The air is still, but no one is sleeping. Across the capital, the blue glow of cell phones lights up faces filled with uncertainty. Some scroll through election updates, others whisper prayers in the dark. Outside, sirens pierce the silence. Cameroon, once praised as the anchor of Central African stability, now trembles at the edge of political unrest. 3 days after the presidential election of October 12, 2025, the country finds itself divided between two truths. One is written in law, guarded by institutions. The other lives in the streets, carried by the voices of those who believe they've been silenced. In this fragile balance, democracy itself is being tested. For over 4 decades, Cameroon has been ruled by President Paul Biya, now 92 years old, a man whose calm authority has outlived generations. But as time stretches on, a new rhythm is rising: younger voters, a digital public, a society demanding answers in real time. And that rhythm is clashing against an aging political system built for another era. So the question tonight is not merely who won the election. It's deeper. When a people stop believing in their institutions, does the law still have meaning? When authority outlasts legitimacy, can order still protect peace? These questions echo far beyond Yaoundé or Douala. They speak to every nation that clings to structure while its citizens cry for renewal, even here in the West, where democracy itself is struggling to hold trust. Cameroon's story is no longer just African. It's human, a story about belief fatigue and the fragile bridge between power and principle. Stay with us as we explore how one election and one man's defiance could reshape the spine of Central Africa. Please share if you believe that legitimacy must come from the people. Subscribe if you believe that truth still matters, even when whispered through the noise. When the ballots closed on the evening of October 12, 2025, Cameroon expected another predictable transition, an orderly announcement, a familiar calm and life returning to its quiet rhythm. But this time, something broke the pattern. Issa Cheroma Bakari, the 58-year-old leader of the Front pour l'Alliance Nationale du Cameroun, once a loyal minister under President Paul Biya, stepped before the cameras and declared victory. "The people have spoken," he said, his voice firm, yet trembling slightly, as though aware of the storm he was about to summon. Within hours, his statement rippled through social media, transforming optimism into confrontation. Bakari claimed his campaign had gathered polling results from across the country, from Yaoundé to Douala, from the diaspora voting stations in Paris and Washington, all confirming what he called an undeniable people's victory. Yet what made the world pause wasn't his confidence. It was what he refused to do next. He declined to appeal to the Constitutional Council, the very institution responsible for validating election outcomes. When asked by his ally Emmanuel Sim during a radio interview on Bailoff FM why he wouldn't contest the results legally, Bakari replied sharply, "Appeal," to do what his tone carried both defiance and despair, a statement that resonated across a population long suspicious of institutional fairness. That single phrase, "appeal to do," what became the political slogan of frustration. In the markets of Douala, taxi drivers repeated it. On university campuses, students turned it into a chant. It was more than sarcasm. It was a verdict on a system many no longer trusted. For decades, Cameroon's Constitutional Council has been accused of bias toward the ruling Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, CPDM. Since the controversial constitutional amendment of 2008 that removed presidential term limits, faith in electoral independence has eroded steadily. President Biya's rule, extending back to 1982, had survived insurgencies, corruption scandals, and secessionist uprisings not through reform, but through control. And so when Bakari refused to engage with that control, his defiance cut deep. To his followers, it was moral courage, the assertion that legitimacy flows from conviction, not certification. To his critics, it was reckless, a populist move that threatened the last fragile thread of institutional order. Meanwhile, the government responded with cold precision. Minister of Territorial Administration Paul Atanganji issued a stern communiqué condemning Bakari's self-proclamation as illegal, arrogant, and destabilizing. Quoting Article 137 of the Electoral Code, he reminded the public that only Elections Cameroon Elecam and the Constitutional Council have the legal authority to announce results. The tone was bureaucratic but unmistakable. The state would tolerate no parallel power. As both sides hardened their stance, the streets began to stir. In the western city of Dang, a local office of the ruling CPDM was set ablaze. Flames devoured party banners, and the footage shaky recorded on a phone flooded Facebook and WhatsApp. "The fire you ignore," an elderly shopkeeper murmured, watching the screen, "eventually burns the house." In Douala, barricades appeared overnight. Youths drummed on metal cans, waving handwritten placards reading, "We are not blind anymore." The police answered with tear gas and water cannons. Across Yaoundé, checkpoints multiplied. Soldiers in camouflage stared into car windows, searching for faces, not weapons, because fear itself had become the enemy. Inside the ministries, officials urged calm, but behind closed doors, unease spread. For the first time in decades, the question of succession, once whispered, was now being debated openly. At 92, President Biya remained the oldest active head of state in Africa. His presence, both physical and symbolic, had long been Cameroon's anchor, but that anchor was now dragging through turbulent waters. The government's message was clear: legality must prevail. Bakari's message was simpler: belief must return. Between those two principles, legality and belief, lies the fragile soul of a nation trying to decide who it still trusts. As one political analyst wrote that night, Cameroon is not witnessing a battle for power. It is witnessing a battle for faith in the ballot, in the law, in itself. By the morning of October 15th, Cameroon was no longer debating who won. It was debating what truth even meant. In the markets of Douala, rumors moved faster than cars. Screens flickered with conflicting vote tallies. On one feed, Bakari's face appeared surrounded by cheering crowds. On another, the Minister of Territorial Administration stood behind soldiers declaring that order will be restored. Between the two, ordinary citizens searched for something that felt real. Then came the images that changed everything. A short, trembling video shot on a cell phone, fire roaring through a local CPDM office in the city of Dong. A flag burning against the night. Voices crying, "Let them see our anger." Within hours, it spread across WhatsApp groups, Twitter threads, and Facebook pages from Yaoundé to Washington. What began as a metaphor, "the fire you ignore eventually burns," the house had become literal. For many, that night felt like a breaking point. The police moved swiftly, arresting several suspects. Jean Nkwete, Secretary General of the ruling party, condemned the act, calling it terrorism disguised as frustration. Yet outside the government compound, frustration had already become a language of its own. In Douala, young men erected makeshift barricades. Women banged cooking pots in protest. Tear gas clouded the streets. The rhythm of dissent had begun. Across social media, one phrase dominated: "The law is at work, but belief in the law is fading." It became the unofficial soundtrack of a country slipping into disbelief. Journalists and analysts warned of an information war. "When the dust rises," one commentator said, "you can no longer see the lion's footprints." Meaning, in chaos, truth disappears. Every smartphone had become a newsroom, every rumor a headline. Disinformation blended with outrage, and in that fog, the line between protest and panic blurred. International voices soon joined the chorus. The U.S. Congressional Research Service, the Atlantic Council, and France's Jeune Afrique all released analyses describing the same risk: a legitimacy crisis. They warned that if electoral transparency was not restored, Cameroon's political system, already aging and centralized, could fracture beyond repair. Behind diplomatic walls, discussions turned from if to when. Washington, Paris, and Abuja quietly reached out to regional mediators, urging preventive engagement before protests became a regional firestorm. Cameroon's Peace One envoy remarked, "is Central Africa's spine. If it breaks, the region collapses." And indeed, the stakes were continental. The Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline, vital to regional economies, runs through the heart of the country. The ports of Douala and Kribi sustain trade for Chad-Congo and the Central African Republic. Even a week of unrest could ripple outward, disrupting shipments, cutting revenue, and shaking investor confidence across the CMAC zone. But the deeper crisis was not economic. It was psychological. For decades, Cameroonians had lived under what some scholars call the politics of stillness, a system that prizes order above all else. Now that stillness was cracking. A generation raised on smartphones and digital transparency was demanding real accountability. "If you cannot trust the count," a student in Yaoundé told the BBC, "you cannot trust the country." In response, government loyalists organized counter-rallies in support of the president. State television replayed messages of calm, urging patience until the Constitutional Council announced its verdict. But patience is a currency that modern politics no longer holds in abundance. The Constitutional Council, though constitutionally empowered, has long been perceived as a tool of continuity rather than reform. Its silence over the growing chaos only deepened suspicion. For Bakari's supporters, the council's credibility was already bankrupt, for the establishment acknowledging that would mean admitting weakness. Thus, the two narratives collided, both claiming to defend democracy, both convinced the other was destroying it. Between them stood a weary population exhausted by slogans desperate for stability. As dusk fell again over Yaoundé, an old man watching the news whispered a proverb into the radio static: "When the rooster crows too early, it wakes the serpent." It was a warning that Bakari's premature declaration might have stirred forces the nation wasn't ready to face. Yet for many others, that same act was proof that Cameroon's future no longer belonged to silence. At that moment, the battle lines were no longer political. They were generational, between those who had grown up fearing change and those who now demanded it, even if it came through fire. In the days that followed the fire in Dang, something far more dangerous than flames began to spread: uncertainty. In Yaoundé, taxi drivers refused to work after sunset. Markets closed early. Parents kept their children home from school. "We've seen elections before," one mother said quietly, "but never this much fear after the vote." The fear wasn't of soldiers or even protesters. It was of not knowing who truly held power. Cameroon's institutions were still functioning technically. The National Commission for Final Counting met as scheduled, with judges, civil servants, and party representatives sitting under the glare of television lights. 10 appeals had been filed by smaller opposition parties, each alleging fraud or procedural errors. The Constitutional Council promised a final verdict within 10 days. On paper, democracy was alive. In reality, it was gasping for breath. The divide was no longer simply political, it was existential. For many Cameroonians, the system itself, built over 4 decades of Paul Biya's rule, had lost its moral weight. Bureaucracy continued, but belief had collapsed. "The law is like a roof," an old teacher told a local radio host. "You can fix the leaks, but if people stop trusting it to keep out the rain, they will sleep elsewhere." That elsewhere was already visible in the streets. Civil society groups began forming spontaneous committees to protect the people's will. In Douala and Kribi, pastors, imams, and community elders gathered in church basements and mosques to mediate between angry youths and nervous authorities. They weren't negotiating votes, they were negotiating peace. But the political fallout was far-reaching. Within the ruling party, quiet fractures appeared. Younger members, long frustrated by the dominance of the old guard, began questioning the government's rigid response. "We are defending a legacy," one CPDM youth coordinator said anonymously. "But if that legacy costs us the country, what will be left to defend?" Meanwhile, Bakari's camp, buoyed by street support but isolated institutionally, struggled to balance passion with prudence. His refusal to appeal had given him moral authority, but left him without legal standing. Diplomats described it as a revolution caught between symbolism and structure. Outside the political class, the economic toll grew heavier each day. The ports of Douala slowed shipments delayed by security checks. The Chad-Cameroon pipeline faced partial disruptions as workers refused to travel through conflict zones. Fuel prices climbed. Bread prices followed. The crisis that began in ballots was now being felt in kitchens. In the countryside, silence carried its own tension. Farmers in the west reported intimidation from local officials. Teachers in the north said schools were told to avoid political discussions. Every conversation became cautious, every word potentially dangerous. What frightened observers most was not the protests, but the paralysis. For the first time in decades, Cameroon's famed stability, its quiet order, its predictability felt brittle. "Indecision," one journalist wrote, "has become our national policy." Analysts began outlining 3 possible scenarios. 1. The Constitutional Council validates Biya's victory, restoring formal order but deepening public cynicism. 2. A partial annulment or rerun, legally plausible but politically volatile. 3. Recognition of Bakari's claim, almost unthinkable within current power structures, yet quietly discussed by international mediators. Each path carried its own peril. But the 4th possibility, no decision at all, was the most dangerous. A prolonged limbo would erode public confidence, discourage investment, and embolden radicals. The deeper truth, however, was psychological. Cameroon's people were tired not of politics, but of being spectators in their own history. "We don't want to overthrow a young protester," in Douala said. "We just want to believe again." That longing, simple, almost sacred, has become the quiet heartbeat of a nation standing between fatigue and hope. From Washington to Paris, diplomats are watching Cameroon with quiet unease. The crisis may appear domestic, but its tremors reach far beyond Yaoundé's crowded avenues. For the United States, Cameroon is more than a point on the map. It's a strategic hinge in Central Africa, a partner in counterterrorism, and a vital corridor for regional trade and energy. American analysts at the Congressional Research Service and the Atlantic Council had warned for months that without a credible mechanism for succession, Cameroon's stability could collapse from within rather than from invasion. Their prediction now feels chillingly accurate. In private briefings, U.S. officials described the election turmoil not as an isolated dispute, but as a potential systemic fracture, one that could disrupt regional supply chains and weaken America's security partnerships across Central Africa. Washington's public tone, however, remains cautious. The State Department has called for restraint and respect for due process, echoing the same phrasing used in past African crises. But behind the diplomatic language lies a deeper concern that the old formula of supporting stable incumbents is no longer sustainable. For decades, U.S. and European policy toward Cameroon was built on predictability. President Paul Biya, though authoritarian, was seen as a dependable anchor in a volatile region. His cooperation against Boko Haram and transnational smuggling made him a known quantity. But at 92, Biya's longevity now feels less like stability and more like paralysis. A senior Western diplomat speaking anonymously to Le Monde Afrique put it bluntly, "You can't build regional peace on a leader who can barely stand." The French position is equally delicate. France has deep economic interests in Cameroon, from energy infrastructure to trade via the Kribi and Douala ports. Yet public sentiment across Francophone Africa has turned sharply against Paris. Any overt interference could ignite anti-French protests like those that erupted in Burkina Faso and Niger. So Paris waits, careful not to look like it's pulling strings, but still deeply invested in the outcome. Across Africa, reactions are divided. In Abuja, Nigeria's government is alarmed. A destabilized Cameroon would threaten cross-border trade and push refugees westward. In Chad and Congo, leaders fear the precedent of mass protests succeeding against entrenched regimes. Meanwhile, Pan-African voices from Senegal's civil society to Ghanaian think tanks are framing Cameroon's unrest as part of a broader continental reckoning. This is not just about Cameroon, one commentator wrote in the Africa Report. It's about an entire generation asking whether independence without institutional renewal is still freedom. Amid these reflections, one country stands out in contrast: Burkina Faso. Under President Ibrahim Traore, the Sahel nation has become a symbol of reform from within, challenging foreign dependence, redistributing resources, and redefining sovereignty. Where Cameroon's crisis exposes exhaustion, Burkina Faso's revolution represents renewal. For many Western observers, that juxtaposition is uncomfortable. The African narrative they once controlled order through continuity is being rewritten by a younger generation demanding self-determination. And in that sense, Cameroon's struggle is not a crisis. It is a mirror reflecting the global decline of trust in institutions from Washington to Yaoundé. As one American analyst put it on CNN, the question is not whether Cameroon will change. The question is whether the world will listen before it does. Night falls again over Yaoundé. The lights flicker, the streets quiet down, but the unease lingers. Cameroon is holding its breath, not for another speech, not for another statement, but for clarity. And clarity in moments like this is more powerful than any victory. In the coming days, the Constitutional Council will announce its final verdict. On paper, that moment should settle everything, but everyone knows it will only open another chapter. Because the question tearing through Cameroon tonight is no longer who governs, but how governance survives when trust is gone. For over 4 decades, President Paul Biya embodied the idea that stability equals strength. But age has turned that stability brittle. His silence now feels less like wisdom and more like distance, a metaphor for institutions that no longer hear the people they claim to represent. At 92, his very longevity has become a mirror of the system itself, unbroken but unrenewed. And so Cameroon stands between two futures. One clings to continuity, legality, without legitimacy. The other demands renewal, legitimacy, even without legality. Between them lies the dangerous middle ground of paralysis, where uncertainty becomes policy and fear becomes habit. History teaches us that nations rarely collapse from noise. They collapse from silence, from ignoring the small fires until they consume the house. Négligez le feu que vous ignorez, et il brûlera la maison. That old proverb carries more truth today than ever before. But there is another saying: the wind does not break the tree that bends. Flexibility is strength. If Cameroon can bend through dialogue, humility, and reform, it can survive this storm without breaking. The world is watching. Diplomats will measure outcomes, investors will measure risks. But for the millions of ordinary Cameroonians, the measure that matters is simpler. Will life go on? Will peace hold? Will their children believe again? And for the rest of us watching from afar, in America, in Europe, across Africa, this moment demands reflection too. When institutions stop earning faith, democracy becomes theater. The same questions haunting Yaoundé today echo quietly in Washington, in London, in Paris. So perhaps Cameroon's struggle is not just a warning. It's a mirror held up to all of us. Victory without peace is defeat in disguise. Power without principle is only delay before collapse. If dialogue prevails, Cameroon can still write a new chapter, one defined not by defiance, but by wisdom. But if pride wins over patience, the cost will be measured not in ballots, but in broken lives. Share this video if you believe Africa's strength lies not in its rulers, but in its resilience. Subscribe if you believe that truth, even whispered, can still change the world.